Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. Climate Advisors is excited to be hosting this event along with the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center on advancing industrial decarbonization and climate-aligned trade. My name is Claire Langley. I am Vice President of Programs at Climate Advisors, a Washington, D.C. consulting firm that works to strengthen climate action in the United States and around the world through research, analysis, public policy advocacy, and communication strategies in several key sectors. We are also the Secretariat for the Consortium for Climate-Aligned Trade, or CCAT, which is a consortium of experts and think tanks that's engaging the G7 on increasing ambition in trade and industrial sectors. Today's expert conversation will center on opportunities for advancing solutions to align trade and climate and decarbonize industrial sectors. We will discuss what key milestones are on the horizon and where significant progress can be made. In recent years, we have seen the international community make great strides in elevating the issues of industrial decarbonization and climate-aligned trade, and we expect that to continue in the coming years as rapid and deep decarbonization of energy-intensive industrial sectors will be vital for the international community to meet mid-century climate goals. Energy-intensive industrial sectors that produce internationally traded materials and commodities, such as cement, aluminum, chemicals, hydrogen, fertilizer, and steel, account for slightly more than 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In 2021, the G7 launched the Industrial Decarbonization Agenda to promote greater cooperation, and last year, G7 leaders pledged to work toward the creation of a climate club, which has the potential to lead to greater industrial decarbonization through tighter collaboration on climate-aligned trade. This year, the G7 took more important steps as climate, environment, and energy ministers agreed to decarbonize industry within the Paris timeframe. At the recent G7 summit, leaders issued a Clean Energy Economy Action Plan that pledged to promote climate-aligned trade policies, agreed to reduce tensions when managing differences on climate-related trade policies, and committed to work together on difficult technical issues, such as addressing data transparency and quality. These outcomes were all in line with recommendations we developed in the Consortium for Climate-Aligned Trade. While the G7 has begun to prioritize industrial decarbonization and climate-aligned trade, countries are taking action at home or with close partners to utilize trade policy to reach climate goals and decarbonize their industries. For example, the European Union is implementing a carbon border adjustment measure to come into effect in October, and this will combat carbon leakage and incentivize the trade of greener goods. Other countries, including Canada, the UK, and the United States, are also considering adopting their own carbon border fees. Another potential game changer in decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors is the greening of industrial policy. In the US Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, there are a wide range of incentives to stimulate private sector investment in technologies and infrastructure that will create jobs and reduce emissions. There is also greater attention to these issues in different international forums. The World Trade Organization, OECD, Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, and the International Energy Agency have all advanced discussions that have deepened collaboration for climate-aligned trade and industrial decarbonization. While there has been significant progress in both the international arena and at the national and subnational levels, there are a host of uncertainties and risks on the horizon, but also opportunities, which we'll be discussing in today's event. One key development to watch is the outcome of negotiations between the EU and the United States on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum this fall. This has the potential to further deepen transatlantic cooperation on bolstering production of low-carbon industrial goods and greening international trade. And we are thrilled to have an expert panel today to discuss just that. Before turning to the discussion, I have a few small housekeeping notes to mention. This event is public and on the record. We are live streaming via Zoom as well as on Twitter and YouTube. We encourage all of you to post about today's discussion and share on social media using the hashtag #ACEnergy, hashtag ACEnergy, and tagging us at AC Global Energy or at Climate Advisors. Those watching via Zoom can submit questions by visiting askac.org and selecting this event. The link will also be shared in the Zoom chat or can be found on @AC Global Energy's Twitter page. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the discussion today. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, George Frampton. George is a distinguished senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Climate Policy Project at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, where he works on industrial decarbonization and the climate and trade nexus. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone who is watching today. The G7 appears to be looking more lately to the WTO as a venue for addressing trade and climate harmonization. So we're fortunate to have with us today Dan Esty, the Hillhouse Professor of Environmental Law and Policy at Yale University, but he's currently on public service leave this year at the WTO, and he'll kick off our session and say a few words about opportunities and challenges for WTO reform and policy development at the WTO on the broader issues of trade and climate. After Dan's remarks, we're going to switch to what many consider to be the leading edge of the trade climate challenge right now, which is the urgent need for the international community to come together on generally accepted standards for embedded carbon, first in steel and cement and other high carbon traded goods, and begin to construct a multilateral framework for housing the transparent data that's going to be required to apply these standards credibly. So what can we expect this year on green steel standards and data from the new, when CBAM comes into effect in October? The work of the IEA and OECD, progress is being made here on standard setting by almost a half dozen partnerships, as Claire mentioned, such as IDDI and Steel Zero, the US-EU sustainable steel discussions, which are supposed to culminate in October and November, and the new nascent climate club, which is interim lodged at OECD. So the question is, can this collection of parallel initiatives be brought more closely together? And if so, where and by whom? The focus on these issues, after Dan's initial comments, we're going to be joined today by four other experts. Peter Levi is an energy analyst on the steel team at IEA, Claire Broadbent, head of sustainability at World Steel, Cecile Seguineau is an analyst and on the steel team at steel decarbonization team at OECD, and Max Grunig, senior policy advisor for E3G. Now, many of you know Dan Esty started out at EPA more than 20 years ago and part of negotiating the UNFCCC, the author of or contributor to more than a dozen books, many articles, more than a few on trade and environment. So Dan, over to you.
George, thank you very much. And thanks to the Atlantic Council team that helped pull this together. Claire, thanks. And to you and the Climate Advisors Group. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. And really thanks to all of you who've taken time out of your busy days and busy lives to think together about the path forward. And for all of you who pay attention to the climate change policy development process, you are aware that COP28 coming up at the end of the year in Dubai is going to have a major focus on a number of elements, but the stock take of how we're doing against the need to bring down emissions in line with what the scientific community is telling us is required, which is by most countries set now as net zero emissions by 2050. And we're going to find with the stock take, not to spoil anyone's anticipation of the outcome in Dubai, we're going to find that the world community as a whole is falling short and most countries are falling short. And this is going to raise a question, what are we to do country by country? And the answer, I think, in part is to look for new places to turn for leverage to drive transformational change. And from my point of view, one of the most critical points of leverage that has been underattended to up till very recently is the trading system, trade policy, and the rules and practices of the World Trade Organization in particular, but the trading system more broadly. And I do think that is an opportunity that we need to flesh out more fully. And George, you've highlighted the number of places where people are beginning to think about this. The WTO has been part of this conversation, particularly vis-a-vis steel, having hosted now a series of conversations on green steel. And I just want to bring to the fore what I think is emerging from this. First of all, it's quite clear that there are going to be divergent climate change strategies and policies across the world. The United States is going one direction with the IRA and its structure of subsidies that are delivering massive amounts of money to bring the world broadly, but the United States, of course, in particular, toward a clean energy future. European Union has got its approach that is largely focused on greenhouse gas pricing and its carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I do think the fundamental question is, how can we, as a world community, ensure that these divergent strategies don't contend with each other, but rather reinforce each other? And that is a key element of what the WTO team under Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is thinking about, pushing forward on. It's what Dr. Ngozi spoke about last week at the Paris Summit on rethinking the global financial architecture. And I think she reminded people there, and I want to remind all of us on this conversation today, that finance is critical. We do need ramped up resources to deliver the kind of technologies at speed and scale across the world and projects and infrastructure. But it is actually those elements that are going to be distributed by trade, along with innovation being driven, best practices being identified, creativity being spread, best ideas being shared. So the trading system has a lot to do with progress. And I want to just call out, and we can go into this in more depth and detail in the discussion and the panel dialogue that follows. But I do think there is going to need to be some work to ensure that we don't end up with those parties that care about really driving climate change progress fighting each other rather than pulling together to drive the world towards this clean energy future that so many of us aspire to. And I think in this regard, let me just offer a couple of quick thoughts. I do think the European Union has done everyone a favor by putting forward a structure for border carbon adjustment. Of course, we really want to talk about not just carbon adjustment, but greenhouse gas emissions adjustment. And I would argue ultimately sustainability adjustment, because it does seem to me we've come to a point where we should declare as a world community that any company that is getting competitive advantage in global markets based on underperforming on sustainability, on global commitments to action on climate change in particular, should not have an opportunity to seize market share or gain profit from that underperformance. So I think the European Union is conceptually correct in the direction it's going, but I would argue there's some methodological flaws in the CBAM strategy in particular. And let me quickly highlight those, and then I'll pass the virtual microphone back and we can come back to these issues in more detail in a moment. But first of all, I think the European Union has gotten itself in some challenge by being seen as unilateral in declaring that there is only one kind of policy that works. It's explicit carbon pricing, and other policies are going to be judged as value zero. And the differential that you're going to get a tariff based on is the full difference between the European Union carbon price and your policy. So I think it's probably going to be difficult to advance a only one approach is acceptable. The trading rules have long said we focus not on form, but on substance. People have to have flexibility to approach policy in different ways. I think the European Union is also challenged by saying that the carbon price is the European carbon price. Why aren't we working towards a global social cost of carbon? Third, I think there's challenges around how you measure the embedded greenhouse gases in traded goods. Europe should not unilaterally declare this, but rather there should be protocols identified. And that's where I think the conversations going on with a number of industries, steel industry, shipping industry, and some others are very helpful. Sector by sector approaches that work out these measurement strategies and protocols, I think are going to be very useful. And finally, I think the European Union has got some challenges around the issue of fairness and equity. I do think in the sort of climate conversation, the need for a just transition has been taken very seriously. I personally think lack of progress in recent decades can be traced in part to under-attention to the need to really manage the transition. So I don't think the European Union's current proposal, which is to hold on to the vast majority of the resources collected in any border carbon adjustment, is going to work. I think we really need to see a much greater push for resources being put forward in a way that helps the developing countries in particular carry forward their transitions. Now, there's a whole set of issues around the IRA that we don't have, or at least I don't in my opening comment have time to get into. I'm happy to talk about how that also probably needs to be made more flexible so that it does not seem to be an obstacle to cooperation on climate change, but rather is recognized for what it is, and that is an enormous investment in moving the world towards a sustainable future. So let me pause and hand back the virtual microphone to George and say that I'm happy to dig into all of this in more detail in the panel discussion that follows.
Thank you, Dan. Peter Levi, the IEA was tasked with Japan as president of the G7 this year to come up with detailed recommendations in the specific area of measuring embedded carbon in traded goods, which looks like it's really an essential first step toward not only useful trade instruments, but also perhaps public purchase and other policies that promote industrial decarbonization. How do you see the IEA's recommendations going forward here over the rest of this year?
Thanks very much, George, for the question. Thank you for the invitation to give the IEA's perspective here. And maybe I'll take one step back before Japan's G7 presidency, back to the kind of institution of the industrial decarbonization agenda that Claire mentioned in her opening remarks. This is the US and the UK together in 2021. This was taken forward and the first substantive input was requested from us by the German G7 presidency in 2022. And that's when we first started talking about analyzing and providing input on the topic around definitions as to what constitutes near zero emission steel, and at that time it was cement was front and center as well. And there's really two sides to this definitions topic. I think there's the ambition level and the sort of normative threshold component. What is the performance level that is agreed to be a certain environmental performance that has to be reached? And then there's the how do you measure it? What's included? What are the rules, etc. In catching back up to where George dialed me in there, the Japan's G7 presidency really asked us to provide more input in a report that we released in May on this second component, so on the measurement methodology component and the data collection frameworks that then go alongside those measurement methodologies to really facilitate their use. And so this work really comprised initially a review to see where we were at with steel specifically, I should say. So we were focusing on steel this year. Look at what measurement methodologies for granular measurements at the product and production level for steel are already available. So making sure that we don't start afresh or create more duplication. Identify any differences and any areas of development for each of the existing areas for which we developed net zero principles to guide the development of these standards in this area, and then to establish the same thing. So what existing data collection frameworks and what development needs to take place on the data collection framework side. So that was really the work that Japan asked us to look at, and we've been developing our thinking specifically on this measurement methodology area. And it immediately sounds very technical and perhaps dull to some of your audience, but it really is so fundamental. If you cannot speak in the same language, in terms of what is a kilo of CO2 as it corresponds to this boundary, what is what product are we talking about? What measurement are you going to get with your methodology versus the one I'm going to get with mine? If you cannot compare those things, then it's really difficult to move forward on many of the policy areas that Dan was just describing when it comes to the arteries of international trade and how different jurisdictions really speak to each other and collaborate, which is really a kind of more in the steel sector and in any sector that has traded outputs. Really, we identify that international collaboration is needed on procurement, on innovation, or finance, on many of the areas Dan already covered. But but certainly on this development of standards and measurement. So that's really where we've been focusing, and maybe I'll leave it there for now and come back to some of the kind of more specific principles and suggested actions that we laid out in our report earlier this year for our members and the G7, because that's the context of this work at the moment. That's a vehicle for which we've found it's been a very fruitful vehicle for the leadership and the thinking that group has shown, but we do need to broaden out that group, obviously, if we're going to touch significant percentages of steel production, cement production around the world.
Peter, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Claire Broadbent from World Steel. Claire, there is a point of view that on the whole industrial decarbonization of steel front, that industry working with some of these public-private partnerships like the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative and Responsible Steel First Movers is actually ahead of governments on these issues. How do you see this whole issue playing out in terms of actual achievables and steps forward over the next year or so?
Right, thanks, George, and hi, everyone. Well, I think that one thing that we don't want to see is yet another initiative being developed or another methodology being developed. By having all these discussions, I think one thing that's very clear is that there are different methodologies are actually going to be required because people need the data for different purposes. Some of these initiatives are looking at company targets, some are looking at site-based emissions, some are looking at product-based emissions, so you can see what the embodied carbon is in the product you're selling to the customer. So it is clear that there is going to be the need to have these different approaches, but what is also very clear is that we need to have these common building blocks which are used as the basis for any of these embodied carbon emissions calculations, that they all need to have this interoperability between them so that it's based on the same data and the same sort of boundaries depending on what the needs are. Within World Steel, we've been working on data and methodology since the middle of the 1990s. So this isn't a new thing for us. We've certainly got our methodologies which are well integrated in each of the many of the steel producers, but they weren't necessarily set up for the purposes of what's needed to be done today. So I know that someone's asked, is there an overview of the steel companies and how each of them are performing and seeing a hierarchy of who's better than who. We have this data within World Steel. We collect the data with an aligned methodology, but it isn't something that we obviously make available publicly. Through the work that Peter's been talking about and talking about this common methodology, there is a need that we look at, or we've already started in terms of updating the methodology that we developed but probably 15 years ago. It was developed for different purposes, and by doing that and having this fed through into the work through the G7, then hopefully this could lead to more data being made available as people are requiring. But another of the challenges I see is that there's quite a lot of the discussion focuses around North America and Europe. And while this is all very good, I think it's really key that the other sort of, particularly the developing nations, but if we look at India, China, other Asian countries, it's really key that these areas are brought along as well and are actively contributing to the discussions, not just signing up and saying they're part of specific initiatives, but really getting involved in the development of methodologies to make sure that what's being developed for them is fit for purpose and not focusing too much on the developed world. And then finally, it's also about making sure that we're being consistent with other materials. We have our specific issues for steel, but when you're ultimately looking at procurement of products, we need to make sure that materials are being assessed on a common basis, whether it's steel, concrete, aluminium, that those issues are being consistently addressed throughout the different material industries.
Thank you, Claire. Cecile Seguineau from OECD, you've just recently issued a report illustrating the diversity of the industry that Claire just mentioned. Very different across markets, across countries, across technologies, which implicates all of the trade issues that have bedeviled the steel industry, supposed overcapacity, and so forth over the last few years. How do you see the OECD's work here over the next 6 or 9 months?
So thank you for your question and for the invitation. So maybe I would just first start by saying that yes, it's important to recognize the leadership role that the G7 had indeed the past few years on the question on data methodology, as Peter mentioned also, because if we just look 2 years back, just in the past 2 years, there has been the IDA set up, the discussion on emission material production and on emission measurement standard. So clear momentum on this topic and also on data and methodology, and I see some positive sign on that front, because first, there is no, I would say, wider awareness of the crucial role that these methodologies and data plays in several policy domains, and that these data and methodology aspects are absolutely necessary to advance in implementation, because as we mentioned, they underlie the definition for low carbon, low emission steel, and the basis for many building blocks, including trade, finance, or taxonomy, the public procurement. And a second point was as a positive sign for industry decarbonization and moving towards implementation is the inclusion of the industry actor in this discussion, both as know and implementers for emission accounting. So I see this as really as positive sign. And then, as you mentioned, it has to move the conversation forward, of course, and I would say in particular on 2 key aspects, on implementation and inclusiveness, as Claire just mentioned too. So of course, first on implementation, by following up on the IDA conclusion, and so implementing the recommendation as a prerequisite to implement any trade policy that would be based on emission content criteria and aim to be aligned with climate goal. And on the second point on inclusiveness for industry decarbonization in general, but also on this question on standard and methodology, on the need indeed to include in the discussion, as Claire was mentioning, especially the producing country from developing economy to succeed in global decarbonization, but also to increase the level playing field. And as an example here, indeed, I will just echo to the report you mentioned, the report we prepare for the G7 presidency on the heterogeneity of steel decarbonization pathway, where we highlighted that indeed such heterogeneities in the steel industry across countries should be considered, for instance, on the question of developing standard to precisely build common ground. And the other point to move forward, and for which we think that we should continue and we'll work on that, is really about the central question of what about the type of accompanying policy that are needed to support this implementation. So no doubt that this discussion will continue within the G7, but also indeed within the OECD, as on our side, the support on industry decarbonization, I mean, is built on 3 main aspects: on policy focus, expertise, and convening power. And for steel, we indeed work under the framework of the OECD Steel Committee, our long-standing committee structure, focusing on policy implementation and dealing with steel industry challenges. And because indeed trade was one of the historical focus of the committee, and having decarbonization at the top of the agenda, we are building on this sectoral expertise and policy focus to support this agenda and this climate aligned trade consideration. And very recently, indeed, as you mentioned also, we have also supported the IDEA agenda, and with the newly established Climate Club that you mentioned, it is another vehicle for the OECD also to support and collaborate on the industry decarbonization agenda on several topics at stake. And if you may have seen indeed the term of reference of this climate club, so these G7 initiatives launched in 2022 by the German presidency to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So it aims to be an open and cooperative and inclusive forum. and with an initial focus precisely on industry and the EV industry in particular, including steel and cement. And in the term of reference in this, the Climate Club is built on 3 pillars, 3 different but complementary pillars, and which actually cover some of these takes on standard methodology and data, carbon leakage concern, enabling policies and support to developing economy. So on the concept and on the content, the Climate Club 2 will play a role to advance on some of these takes. So.
Cecile, thank you. Max Grenig, E3G has been one of the 5 or 6 or 7 lead nonprofit civil society groups that have been very active in this process over the last couple of years. How do you see the near-term future on particularly on standard setting and on the steel, aluminum, cement decarbonization efforts and the trade aspects of that?
Yes, thank you, George. Thank you also for having me part of this panel. So I think it's important to see also the setting we're operating in. So there's a lot of tensions happening in the field of geopolitics, and it's not possible to separate this out entirely. So I think we need to have this view of the global geopolitics while also looking at the trade and standard setting world, which is of course very, very technical in nature when we come down to the nuts and bolts of it. I think also we need to understand whether we're moving, which world we're moving towards, because are we moving to a net zero world or a decarbonized world, and where on that spectrum are we ending? I think stepping back, looking at CBAM, inflation or carbon border adjustment mechanisms, Inflation Reduction Act, looking at the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, we should also remind ourselves that the idea is that together we can get better outcomes for all. And that sometimes gets a little bit lost in the discussions we have currently, both in the US and in Europe, and where other players then feel shut out or don't see the on-ramp. And that's an important on-ramp both for development purposes, for climate progress purposes, but also for the wider geopolitics. So I think important here is dialogue. I think it's very important that their leaders, it's good. I mean, Dan Esty mentioned it's great that the European Union came forward with their carbon border adjustment mechanism. Somebody has to make a first move, but it's also important to be open and to engage and have dialogue. And I think that's where it's lacking. But well, we can't fix the past, but we can make things better in the future. And I think with the global arrangement, we see this repeating, a lack of dialogue and black box where others are cautiously watching what's happening or speculating what might be happening. And then I think that's where the Climate Club, even though it's called a club, is much further ahead with the 21 members, if I counted this or if I have the right information, which includes a lot of non-OECD countries and includes a broader set than the G7, obviously. Still, we don't know if every member of the club is fully committed or to what degree and how binding and ambitious the club will be, but it's a good move. It's a good move in the right direction. In terms of what to expect, I think there is a lot of course, hope for the global arrangement being climate ambitious and resolving a lot of the issues. But there's, of course, also from the information that we hear, still a lot of difference between the EU positions and the US positions. And possibly we might come out with a low compromise, a low common denominator in terms of climate, but also other aspects. Or we might come out of this with an extension of the negotiation deadline, which could be also a way of basically buying more time to resolve these different issues. On the standards and data, of course, there are very different approaches. And I saw it in the chat questions about how to rank steel carbon intensity. And that's, of course, when you come then to the question of scope and also of what you look at. Do you look at the product, the facility, or industry averages? So obviously you get very different results there. And then, of course, scope 1, the direct emissions, or do we go also to scope 2 and even further? And of course, that's where CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the Europeans, is quite unique, and has said basically we're basing this on the European emissions trading system for consistency purposes. But of course, that's a very different story from looking at a holistic emissions profile or life cycle assessment. So that's definitely aspects that need to be reconciled. Maybe finding a compromise in future revisions, but right now we're here. And so I think we need to be also open for divergence or heterogeneity. We also need to understand that different countries have different data availability and different levels of precision in their data. And that has to be also not a stumbling block, but still something we can overcome, because it's very important, as been pointed out. Very nice to see progress in the EU and in the US, but we have much bigger fish to fry, so to speak, in the world of steel and cement and other emission sources. So it's very important that this is designed with not the optimum in mind, but or not the best possible standards in mind, but the best working or the most efficient approach. So I think that's maybe as an inspiration for being ready for compromise. And I think that goes for all parties involved, the Europeans and the Americans and other players as well. Thank you.
Well, Max, thank you for that. Thank you for that plea and that message. I want to go from what you said about geopolitics and back through the heterogeneity that of the industry that Cecile talked to, where Dan started. As Dan pointed out, the CBAM, and as several of you did, really raises the issue. That's important, but trade instruments that really do protect against leakage and are not exclusionary can't be unilateral. There has to be something here that's plurilateral or multilateral, not just one party deciding how to do this. And of course, the EU-US sustainable steel and aluminum discussions are only two parties, even though there was a hope there that others would be brought into that and may still be brought into it. But in the meantime, it seems to me, as you mentioned, Max, the geopolitics here is that the US steel industry, as reflected by some comments in the chat, the US steel industry is roughly the least emitting or cleanest, greenest steel on average of any country in the world. But that's because the industry was fortunate enough to build itself around recycled material, which involves a cut of 60 or 80% of emissions in the manufacture of steel. So the U.S. And also probably Japan are really not that interested in the development of a multilateral system here, not against it, but not very interested in the work that's going on by this group of different coalitions and initiatives to try to develop something that's really multilateral. And the question is, can that effort be advanced, without the U.S. basically participating over the next year or standing on the sidelines? Because the U.S. steel industry's attitude is, well, we're the cleanest, and when other people get around to it, let them come in here. That's not a long-term solution, because we know that in China, and particularly which manufactures more than half the world's steel, And in India, where steel production is going to increase dramatically, simply going to a long-term global strategy of using more recycled material is not possible. That's only a small piece of this. So how do these geopolitical aspects factor in if the need here is to move on a multilateral basis, WTO basis or G7 plus G20 basis, to try to do something that can win broad support? So maybe I'll pitch that to Dan, and then others who want to come in. Dan?
George, thank you. And I do want to stress, by the way, I'm speaking today as a Yale professor, not on behalf of the WTO, but I want to also say, I think Claire gave us the key term, which is interoperability. We've got to find a way to take on board divergent approaches to decarbonization and find ways to link them up. They're not going to balance exactly. They're not going to be exactly the same. But we do need to find ways to get around some of the challenges. Common measurement protocols are a very good place to start. I really do think we want common pricing structures. And then we're going to have some debates, and it may well be that there's going to need to be some time given to those that are evolving from higher pollution levels towards lower. But I think it needs to be carefully structured. And I do think this is where the negotiations will get tough. But I think that we all should be doing the groundwork that needs to be laid in order to build this structure of interoperability. And I do think the world benefits by having an open, multilateral, to the greatest extent possible, trading system that's rules-based and encourages people to cooperate. And it is, been demonstrated over many years and in many sectors that this is how you get a real base of common direction, shared purpose, a sense of economic opportunity from working together. And that's, in my mind, fundamental, not only in trade, but fundamental to what it's going to take to have the world community move successfully toward a clean energy future.
Thanks, Dan. I'd love to throw this out to others. I mean, when the CBAM goes into effect October 1, people are actually going to have to start filing EPDs, environmental product declarations, based on these rules for steel. So the whole thing becomes very real in a real world compliance setting after years of discussion. And in the meantime, the US and the EU are negotiating something different, potentially different, as a way of trying to harmonize both decarbonization and fair trade in steel. So those are two efforts that are very different than, not very different, but they're separate and apart from the work that's going on at places like OECD and IEA to think about a multilateral approach. How do those compete, or can they be put together? Thoughts about that? Max, you're raising your hand, but I was going to call on you anyway.
Right. Yeah. So obviously we don't know yet what the global arrangement will contain in terms of methodology. So it might actually be that it will contain very little to not have this clash, but there is obviously different desires. And we look the EU has the desire to now move ahead with their CBAM design, with their methodology. Of course, some of the details aren't fully fleshed out in the guidance, but it's coming, and it's pretty clear that it's not in line with what the US side wishes to see. And on the other hand, this seems to be one of the red lines on the European side, is to not have a CBAM carve out ex post now for the US side. And of course, on the other hand, the US side does not want to have changes to the Inflation Reduction Act provisions, which is just as impossible on their end. But again, coming back to the third countries, if we can put everybody else in this big bucket of not so common and also very divergent interests, of course, in the third country bucket. But this is very interesting because, of course, we can frame this as these are countries that are feeling pushed back or or losing market access indirectly, or at least competitiveness. But on the other hand, we have to also see, okay, these are countries who want something. What do we want from them? So maybe I'm too transactional for some people here, but I think there's something to be gained. And as long as they're both sides having interest and in having needs, we can find a compromise out there somewhere. And I think there's something to be worked out, because so many people need so many things, be it finance. We talked about it earlier, the Paris summit. We talk about conditions for finance. We talk about, I said, market access, technology transfer, all these aspects. So I could go on. I don't want to take up too much airtime, but I think there is something there if we bridge these silos and break these silos. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me ask another question of all of you, since I was met last week with Cecile at OECD in Paris, and several of the staff who are now at OECD with the interim platform of the Climate Club. Is the Climate Club a place where this multilateral effort for data and standards can be lodged, can be pulled together? And I guess I'm asking, it's not your remit, Cecile, necessarily, but asking that question of you and others, but also of Claire Broadbent, since it seems increasingly that if there's going to be a common multilateral data facility for steel and then moving on to others, that World Steel is going to be a huge part of that, because you have most of the data over the last several decades. And so that's a natural beginning of a multilateral data facility. But where does all this get located? Is the Climate Club, which now, as Max mentioned, it has this G7 members are all members, but some are not too eager to be there. And now a lot of additional members. Is that a platform to begin to really focus the overall effort on multilateral industrial decarbonization? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I could give some thoughts from a World Steel perspective. I think that the actual where the data is going to be located is one question, and it's obviously very important. But I don't see it right now as being one central source of data. I think the whole purpose of having some harmonized methodology for whatever purpose. So whether you've got for trade purposes, for customers, for CBAM or whatever. If you're going back to the data and trying to develop those common methodologies, then it shouldn't really matter that the data is going to be stored in different places. I think the work that Peter's done within the IEA in terms of recommending, okay, let's use as a starting point what's already existing and try to adapt these methodologies. Yes, we have been working on data for a long time. There are ISO standards which are available for site level based emissions measurement and product based measurements. And those are really systems that have been developed on a global level. And they were developed based on the World Steel methodologies. So you already have that sort of level of sort of common understanding. They are being updated to be more sort of fit for purpose for these types of discussions. And I think if we can draw more people into those levels of discussions to have this alignment there. The IEA report also referred to to responsible steel. There are other initiatives and people out there who have, trying to use these methodologies as a common basis. And I think having that and then having different places where, the data can be stored will help things move forward. And I think over time, hopefully some of these differences between the different regions will iron themselves out. The IDGI initiative, the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, is focusing on green public procurement. That's again another place where they want to have a repository of data on a product level. So it's sort of going down the stream of products. having a global database isn't going to be something which would work around the world, because you'd have, Chinese specific ones need to be sort of more local for their needs, and okay, ones in the US. But at least if the basis for the data going in there is on this harmonized interoperable basis, then I think that's already a very big step forward. And then we'll always be having these different initiatives and reasons for why there will be some divergence. The CBAM, for example, is based on the EU ETS methodology, which doesn't go into the same, scope as an EPD. So I think, as these methodologies get developed, you need to start somewhere. And I think if I understand well, the CBAM, although it starts on the 1st of October, it's sort of, it's about data collection at the initial stage, as opposed to acting on that data. And I think, in that initial phase, things will be learned which will help them to adapt their approach accordingly to make sure it is fit for purpose.
Let me pick up on a question in the chat from Alden Meyer, who points out that at Bonn there were developing countries who really wanted the issues around CBAM, friendshoring, and the IRA to be, and these trade-related issues to be brought into the UNFCCC just transition process, but the US and EU were not happy with that and said, well, these trade issues should only be in the WTO. Dan or others, thoughts about the extent to which the UNFCCC process and going to COP28 is a venue where some of the issues about the fairness and protectionist objections to CBAM and other similar programs get discussed?
I would just jump in quickly to say that I think, again, interoperability is going to be critical. The trade regime has to interconnect with the climate change regime. And I think that's being recognized. The United Arab Emirates will host for the first time a trade day at COP28. So I think the connections are being seen. And frankly, one of the things that Dr. Ngozi says whenever she is out talking about this is that trade does represent an opportunity for countries to do more to achieve their climate change goals. And I think we need to take that on board as part of the package. It is also, of course, the case that if some of these issues don't get sorted out, there will be trade disputes that emerge, and it really could be a challenge. So I think the key here is to get the conversations going. The WTO does represent a forum that can bring some of this conversation to a sharper focus. And I think there's a recognition it needs to be done in concert with others. And there's a lot going on that needs to be brought together, George, as you've now said a couple of times. And I think we're learning that certain framing works better than others. The climate club framing, I frankly have found to be hard to sell. Some of you will know that in addition to my work at the WTO currently, I have been running for the last couple of years a project at Yale with colleagues around the world and other institutions, academic and research, something called the Remaking Global Trade for a Sustainable Future project. And in that effort, we have brought people together to talk about climate clubs, among other things. And one of the things we heard back was it's not a good framing. It doesn't sound like a way to bring people together. It sounds exclusive, not inclusive. And I do think the Germans that were pushing this as part of their G7 leadership effort came to recognize that. And the end result was that what's been launched at the OECD is an inclusive forum for climate mitigation approaches. And I think we've got a better framing in that inclusive spirit. So I do think there is a challenge here, and I think it's going to require ongoing discussion. I think it's going to have to start in a number of places, but probably be brought together at some point.
Well, thank you. I do think that the civil society over the last year has pushed really hard to structure any kind of a carbon club as an open arrangement, rather than something you belong to and therefore get certain trade benefits, or you don't belong to and you don't. Some of the irony about one or two parties versus multilateral is that the real future challenge about clean steel, of course, lies with China and India, which probably 10 years from now, the Chinese may only be producing 40 of the world's steel, not 54%, but the Indians may be producing 20 or 25% of the world's steel under current plans, at least. And the calculations, they have not really been involved in these discussions by any means, or at least not nearly enough. With us is Andrew Forth. I'm asked to join here in case there was a little time with Climate Group. Has been very involved in an Asian green steel conference recently, and I wanted to give him just a couple of minutes to talk about what they heard about the Asian, more Chinese and Indian perspectives on all this. Andrew?
Thank you very much, George. Real pleasure to be here and listen to some really insightful comments from the rest of the panel. I was recently in Singapore at Climate Group's Asia Action Summit, where we brought together steel users from sort of shipping, from renewable energy, and from construction to really talk about what they're seeing in the Asian market. And I think one of the things that really stood out was the way in which the debate in Asia is probably more advanced around steel decarbonisation than we're already considering in the West, because it's being pushed by demand from customers in Western markets. There are already significant reporting, ESG, and just general data requirements that are already driving steel users in those markets to look at how they decarbonize. And I think the thing they are really crying out for is, how can we have that global standard and global framework that everyone has mentioned? And I think one of the really crucial points is that it needs to be something that works for the Asian market if it's going to have a realistic impact, both on steel decarbonisation, but also on industrial supply chains in the West. Ultimately, lots of the products that we buy and manufacture in Western markets are going to have inputs from Asia. The ships that build them, the ships that bring them to Asia, from Asia to the world, they're probably going to be made still in Asian markets. And steel is such a crucial part of the decarbonisation puzzle that unless we get a global standard that works, and we get something that is open and understandable for businesses, we're not going to get there. One thing which I think we have touched upon here is the way in which CBAM and the IRA are being perceived in those markets. They're not being seen as opening shots, they're being seen as fundamental changes to the business climate. And I think that's a big opportunity for Asia, but I also think it's a big sort of barrier for countries, particularly because it now creates a dependence for them. The EU's put a CBAM in place. Is it going to follow through and put the mandatory standards, get rid of the free allowances in the ETS scheme, which enable people to actually drive that decarbonisation in their local markets? I'll stop there. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'm really privileged to have been able to listen in and take part.
Andrew, thank you. You mentioned to me in a conversation 10 days ago about a company that is a leading market company of steel containers that's very eager to have a standard and begin to be able to make containers out of green steel, because it knows that in the international market that will be a tremendous advantage to it, business advantage. How does that appetite for market creation and for standards to support it get translated back to the EU-US discussions and into the European-based processes that are trying slowly, but very slowly, to develop final versions of these programs?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating question. And I think, you know, the points that have been made around the significant data collection requirements that are going to be brought in as part of the CBAM are a really crucial part of this. Once external companies are measuring these things, you know, we know that when we have data, it often drives performance improvements. And I think without that data, it's been hard for people to do it. It's been driven in a kind of inconsistent way. But I think getting the message across that this is actually an option. I think policymaker knowledge of steel decarbonisation is still relatively low outside of the people who focus on steel decarbonisation. It'd be great to get it on the agenda of the sort of environmental policymakers, on construction policymakers, on procurement policy drivers, because they are the people who actually can influence it on a practical level. As I think, the more people we can get talking about steel decarbonisation, the better for the future of this debate, I think.
Thank you. Dan, I know you have a hard stop, but I wanted to have one question on the broader issue of trade. Europeans didn't react very well to the IRA and the sort of protectionist aspects of this. And so that's a dialogue. Part of the answer was, well, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it too. Is this whole issue, which people have been working in this field now for 3 years, said was coming on as different governments did more to subsidize green energy and green technology, that there would be, others would complain that was inconsistent with conventional trade rules? I mean, is this issue going to continue to burn, or is it something that people are going to realize we have to soften the potential conflicts, but every government's going to want to do this and do it in different ways, and ultimately there has to be some sort of more or less peace agreement between different countries which are stimulating the energy and the green transition in different ways? How do you see this playing out?
So, George, I think you've summarized it well, and that is to say, we are going to have different countries approach climate change action in different ways. And, I think the United States, after a long period of time where it was not able to really step up to the forefront and do something significant, is now in a place to do something significant. One can, and I do say it's too bad in some regards that it's got the domestic content requirements that are such significant running roughshod over of traditional trade principles. I also think that there is a possibility to see new subsidy structures negotiated going forward. The world of trade in the past was all about tariffs. I think the world of trade in the future is about standards and subsidies. And I think that what we need to do is begin to create a structure that takes that seriously. And I do believe that we should be asking in the trading system, not just, is this distorting trade or disruptive to trade, but we should ask, what's the purpose of the subsidy? And if a subsidy is advancing society broadly in addressing a critical challenge like climate change, one might even argue if it's got positive externalities, to use the economics term, as opposed to negative externalities, perhaps the trading system should evolve towards a kinder look towards those kind of subsidies. It might be paired, by the way, at the same moment with a much tougher stance against subsidies, the purpose of which is to advance things that cause harm to the environment, that are sustainability negatives. So I do think we've got to think in fresh ways about the structure of the trading system, where it goes in the future, and really fold sustainability in at the base of a rethought system. And anyone who's been working on this issue for years will know that I've been on this argument for now 30 years, going back to my book, Greening the GATT, in 1994. I've been joking with people that there's good news and bad news about that book. The good news is that it's still got lots that's relevant, and the bad news is still lots that's relevant. So it's been a long time coming that the trading system has been slow to evolve towards really a sustainability enhancing structure. But I think that conversation is now very much alive and potentially very significant.
Let me ask you what may be a very unfair question, and you may not be able really to answer it given where you are these days. Is the WTO the place to try to structure these innovations? I mean, it's an organization which is obviously a little bit wounded right now, in part by the Trump administration, and also is, been regarded by certainly a lot of the developing world as an agent for Western industry, protect Western industry rather than real free trade. Where are the venues? Where are the processes that can help do the redesign that you're talking about? And I think those of us who work in the climate field all think is absolutely essential.
Again, speaking as a Yale professor here today, I do think this is a live conversation. And I think there's a pretty broad recognition that the trading system serves enormously important purposes. Again, it brings people together around a common economic destiny, creates a sense of shared prosperity. It allows us to drive innovation, bring best practices and creative thinking all around the world. And from a climate change perspective, holds people together in working toward a successful response to climate change. So I'm a big believer that there's positive elements to trade. I'm also one who, as I mentioned, has for 30 years been arguing the trading system needs to be fundamentally rethought, and that the system that was launched after the Second World War was an inclusive structure. Cordell Hull and those that created that original system were very much interested in bringing people together, lifting all countries in the wake of the terrible wars of the first half of the 20th century. And I think the system did that for a good long time, 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 1980s. I believe, and we can debate this probably at another time in more detail, that there was a wrong turn somewhere in the 1980s, 90s, where market fundamentalism, the sort of Washington consensus gone to extremes, was taken on board as part of not just domestic policy in Britain and America and other places, but became embedded in the trading system. And it did become a moment where the system seemed to work largely for the benefit of multinational corporations. But I think you see in Dr. Ngozi now a commitment to people-centered trade, to a more inclusive trade, to a trade that is really lifting many more countries and focused on not just big companies, but small businesses, farmers, people as not just consumers, but workers. And all of that, I think, is an opportunity. And at the same moment, as we're remaking the trading system to do all of that, to embed sustainability at the core. So I think those who say the trade system is a problem misunderstand that it can also be part of the solution. And I do think there is an emerging recognition of that potential. And I'm pleased that so many of those who are speaking on the panel today are committed in the same way to remaking the system so that it can help us get to a sustainable future broadly. By the way, we focus today on climate change, but we need the trade system to help us deliver and protect biodiversity, water protection, reduce chemical exposures, getting plastics out of the ocean. And these are all very much live conversations in the trading system at the WTO. And I do think it remains a forum that is broad-based, 164 members, and as a result brings a lot of different viewpoints together. That's challenging in many regards, but I continue to see it as a very significant opportunity, and one that I think others are now really seeing as a potential. Let me say one more thing in this regard. I believe that there was some terrible misinformation about the trading system disseminated by some what we might think of as relatively high impact, thoughtful, in other cases, folks who were misinformed about the trade world. And I think in particular, people like Joe Stiglitz, who's gone around the world saying to developing countries, you're getting a bad deal here. From my point of view, he suffers from the disease of Nobelitis. What happens when you win a Nobel Prize and think you know everything about everything and you're the smartest guy on every issue. And his analysis telling the developing countries they were losing out in the trading system was just flat out wrong. A rules-based multilateral system actually enables the smaller and weaker countries to link arms and push back on the big and the powerful. And over many years, the developing countries have done pretty well. And many developing countries, not 10, not 20, but 40 or 50 have had huge trade-led growth in recent decades. And I think they've now come to realize it. So it's not just Chile that everyone thinks about, but Mexico, Brazil, Costa Rica, and increasingly Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, Kenya, Morocco, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, all huge growth. And I think what they've now come to realize is to continue that system, they are going to have to lead the effort toward a more sustainable future. And that's exciting. I think that's the real opportunity, is to have all these countries, along with traditional trade-oriented countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Singapore, Britain. And I think there is a growing willingness to really step up to the challenges to remake the system for a sustainable future. And, I hope a lot of the folks listening in today and those on the panel in particular will advance their ideas to make this all happen.
Dan, you're right. We could have at least another 2 hours of this conversation. I want to ask one last question, though, of all the panelists. I mean, the CBAM, which is really based on the fact that European ambition has really accelerated, and that's reflected in the pricing approach and the need to protect from leakage and so forth and competitiveness, has focused a lot of the friction here is in the trade regime was on this few group of commodities: steel, cement, aluminum, and chemicals will be the hard one, and maybe even hydrogen, but certainly fertilizer. A relatively small group of commodities. And it may be that the only way to approach these, since the industries are so different across countries and markets and technologies, is to do this really on a completely sectoral basis. So the multilateral approach to steel and cement and chemicals could be very different. How does that, I'm interested to know whether that's the kind of process that would be better undertaken in a place like the OECD and IEA, or a carbon club arrangement, or whether that kind of sectoral approach is something that's appropriate for the WTO. And I guess I'd ask that to Dan quickly, but since we just have another couple minutes, but also others, any thoughts on that before we close?
I feel like I'm taking a lot of airtime, George. Let me pass the microphone on to others. But I do think you're raising important questions that we've got to jump into, and I think people are starting to be willing to do that.
Max, thoughts about that?
Yeah. I think we'll see inevitably some rise of sectoral approaches. I mean, we just as we speak, they're starting in London. The IMO is getting together and talking about shipping emissions, and that's something you wouldn't necessarily have thought like a couple of years ago. They were always considered a little bit more of the not the first movers on climate action, to put it mildly, but this is really interesting. I'm not saying that this is actually happening, the shipping tax, but maybe, and at least it's a discussion item. And I do think there is definitely this opening. We see this with the global arrangement on steel and aluminum, and there might be others to follow. At least that's the speculation for many, because that makes it definitely more manageable. But of course, we always have this competition now with the CBAM, the umbrella approach, but CBAM might also be not growing anymore in terms of scope of sectors covered if we have successful sectoral approaches that can supplant this. So there's hope there.
And that's a fair comment, that if the system for doing embedded carbon for cement and aluminum move forward separately from the CBAM, there might be some way in which the CBAM gets generalized or multilateralized in the case of those other commodities. Well, thank you all. I'm afraid our time's coming to a close here. We promised to close in a minute. So thank you, everyone in the audience, for tuning in, especially all of the panelists and participants in this discussion. I want to thank my colleagues at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and at Climate Advisors organizing the event, particularly Claire Langley and Matthew Piotrowski at Climate Advisors, Maya Sparkman, Lauren Macedo, and Graham McKillivray from the Atlantic Council. And remind you again that today's discussion is available on the Atlantic Council website. You can go there, look at YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Share it with your colleagues if you found it interesting. We're going to continue our work on these issues. We'll be back with another roundtable in September, focusing on aluminum as well as steel. So I hope you've enjoyed this or found it useful, or both, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.